One of the areas where we get a lot of questions is the Indian Child Welfare Act. We've got a panel of experts to answer your questions. I would love to just have our panel of experts introduce yourself. Just tell us what's your name, your role, and how long you've been doing this. Start with you, Judge.
My name is Rod Souza. I'm a state district court judge in the 13th Judicial District, which is Yellowstone County. I've been serving in that role for just about 10 years now.
Thank you for your service.
And I'm Jenn Weber. I'm a CPS supervisor in the Billings office. I've been with CPS for just under 12 years and a supervisor about 10 and a half of that. And I've been part of the Yellowstone County ICWA court since we started in 2016 and part of the Yellowstone County ICWA recovery court that we've been doing for 4 years now.
Yes.
4 years. Yes.
And I'm Jenn Daniels. My title is a Resource Family Specialist Supervisor. So long and short of that is that I license kinship and youth foster homes and support those homes through Child and Family Services. I've worked for the department for about 13 years. I started doing CPS work and then became the licensing supervisor about 10 years ago.
Wow, thank you all for your service. We're really grateful for all that you do for families. Judge, I'm going to start with you. When was the court started? Tell us a little bit more about ICWA and kind of the why behind it, too.
So the ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, was a law passed in 1978 in the United States. And the purpose for the ICWA was to address some of the child separation that had occurred over the previous century. And probably between about 1880 and then through the 60s and 70s in the United States, about 1/3 of American Indian children were separated from their families. And so the ICWA is a remedial statute to address those issues. The ICWA is often referred to as the gold standard in child protection. And there are really 3 major components. The first is notice, to always give notice to the tribes of any proceedings impacting American Indian children. And that notice provision is critical because it recognizes the tribes as separate sovereigns. And the other components are always to make active efforts to prevent the breakup of the Indian family and also to make active efforts while social workers are working on the case. And then also the other major component is to comply with what are called the placement preferences. And so it's generally known that best practice in child protection is to place with safe and appropriate family if you can. And so the ICWA mandates that there be good cause to deviate from placement preferences if family placement cannot be found.
Yeah, they can't just go do it just because they want to. They've got to have good reasons. They weren't able to find family or whatever the case may be. And I've had the privilege in the last year of being in the court at the Family Recovery Court. It was a privilege. It's a beautiful thing to watch. What is the purpose of the court?
The purpose of the ICWA courts that we have in Yellowstone County is to comply with the letter and the spirit of the ICWA, to improve tribal to state relations as these cases progress through the system, to find safe and permanent options for American Indian children while maintaining those cultural connections. And we started our ICWA project in Yellowstone County in 2016. Our official launch of the larger court was in 2017. Our more intensive family recovery court we launched in 2021. And really the core piece of the ICWA court is to really improve those relationships. And that's the foundation of an ICWA court. And so the child protection workers, the courts, we are always in communication with the tribes. And we are improving those relationships both in the courtroom and outside the courtroom.
What I'm hearing over and over and over again is that there's a lot of communication that's happening. That accurate?
So again, complying with the letter of the law, That's what we're talking about, always making sure that the tribe is getting notice, that the social workers are making active efforts, that we're complying with the placement preferences. The spirit is absolutely trying to involve the tribe from day one in the process, recognizing that these children are enrolled members of a tribe.
Mhm.
Also, the spirit of the ICWA also regards the why. And as I stated earlier, it is a remedial statute. So what we're trying to do is find safe and permanent homes for those children while maintaining those cultural connections. Because culture can be so important in ensuring long-term positive outcomes for those kids, staying connected to their tribe.
Yeah, there was a rupture, and we're making a repair, and we're trying to do it better like we do with a lot of things. What is the role of the tribes themselves in the ICWA cases?
So a tribe, if we've identified a case as an Indian Child Welfare Act case and subject to the law, then the tribe is a party to the case and is involved in the case throughout. Sometimes they will have an attorney who appears at every hearing. Sometimes their ICWA agent will appear at every hearing. And then throughout the duration of a case, along with the hearings inside the courtroom, there's a lot of work outside the courtroom where Child Protective Services is regularly meeting with the ICWA agents and updating the tribe on the progress of the case. So we can always be addressing where are the parents at on their treatment plans, where are we at with the placement preferences, what are we looking at for permanency for this child long term. And so throughout the duration of the case, from removal to permanency, and hopefully, of course, the ICWA is like any other child protection case. The goal is reunification. But if the case isn't dismissed with reunification and we're looking at other permanency options, whether that's guardianship or long-term custody with the department or adoption, we want the tribe involved at every step of the way.
Walk us through the process for a tribe to accept a case within the court.
The tribe will always intervene in the case if the case is subject to the Indian Child Welfare Act. Sometimes a case can potentially be transferred to the tribal court. However, that is a more involved process. As far as transfer goes, it's probably the exception as opposed to the rule. A parent can move to transfer the case to tribal court. However, if the other parent objects, the case will not be transferred. In addition, before a case could ever be transferred to the tribe has to accept jurisdiction. Most tribes have some type of committee, an ICWA committee, where they look at cases on a case-by-case basis and assess whether the case is appropriate for transfer. Oftentimes, the tribes will not transfer because of the age of the case, the amount of resources it would take for the tribe to take on the case, the child's particular needs, maybe the particular placement. And so a lot of factors go into that. But we do have those transfer motions or hearings sometimes. But once again, I would say that transfer is more the exception as opposed to the rule.
Yeah, and what is the role of the department in this kind of a case?
The department's role is the same as any other case. So they have assigned social workers. And those social workers, whether it is the social worker who was involved in the original emergency placement of the child or is now the ongoing social worker, their goal is to make active efforts and reunify the family if possible. So it's like any other case, ICWA or non-ICWA, where Child Protection Services is involved. Their job is the same. The one thing that is a little bit different is, and I've seen such a great cultural change with our ICWA court, is with our social workers going that extra mile on active efforts. And what do I mean by active efforts? I think an example is better in that suppose a parent has a appointment for a chemical dependency evaluation. What might be reasonable efforts you might see in a non-ICWA case is for the social worker to send a letter and say, hey, you've got a appointment on this day, you need to make it. When I think about active efforts, I think about the social worker helping make that appointment and then contacting the parent, making sure they have transportation to and from that appointment to make sure that task occurs to get them on the path to sobriety. And so there are a lot of touch points on a case where CPS is involved. And that's why I come back to the ICWA really being no different than any other case. It's just the gold standard. If our goal is to reunify families safely, then our social workers need to be going that extra mile to make that happen.
Yeah, thank you. That explanation is helpful. Jen, I'm curious, if a child comes into care, what's the ideal placement for them? This would, as he said, it would go for ICWA, but it really would go beyond that. But speak to that.
I agree. It's for any case, right? We want that gold standard even when we're looking for placement options. If that child can't stay in the home and there's a removal, that the child needs to move from that home. The initial activation really is the goal of finding kinship and what that kinship looks like. If it's an ICWA case, if it's a non-ICWA case, we're looking for relationships that this child has in a community. It does not have to be a blood relationship. For ICWA, that's the same standard. So that standard of kinship first is the priority in all of our cases. The placement preference in the ICWA rules really state kinship is first, and then we're looking within, if a child's identified, that within their tribe, and then within any tribe, and then another family that has no relationship or no tribal relationship to them.
Yeah, that's kind of a order of operations and how you're able to place. You've done this more than a dozen years. I'm guessing you've come up against a lot of different misconceptions that people have. Can you tell me a couple of those and kind of clear those up?
I don't know if I can clear them all up today. Maybe we can start though, right? So I think just in people communicating with each other, we have foster parents that know each other, that come to events, that help support one another and hear the stories of each other. When I make a call and say I need a placement for 3 kiddos under the age of 5, some of those first questions I get are they Native? Are they Indian children? And my question is, why do you ask? Right? What's the difference for me? Um, and I think some of that really is some of the things like the judge was sharing before, just in regards to some of those fears um, that families potentially have in regards to what the tribal relations are in regards to a case. So I think that's why we're here today, is just to have some of those conversations about what are some of those basic fears and what are we doing to help alleviate some of that?
Yeah, for a foster family that's hesitant to take an ICWA case because maybe they heard about one thing one time that happened to one person,
Correct.
what would how would you encourage them to educate themselves? What do you think that they need to know?
I think really the breakdown is on most things is just that fear of the unknown. Being able to communicate, being able to ask those questions. And a lot of times, sadly, at the beginning of these cases, we don't know. We may not even know if they have any Native culture on the night I'm calling looking for a placement option. But being able to be part of a team and having those communications and not being fearful if they're Native. I mean, I just encourage people to step out of their comfort zone a little bit and just say, what does that mean? Right? I mean, every time I ask a question, I learn something new. So, what does that mean when we have a child that's from the Crow tribe? Okay, tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me about that family. Tell me about, is there some grandparents that want to maintain a relationship? What other things culturally, socially with other kids are we looking at, just so they have a round picture to make a decision in regards to what's best for their family?
Yeah, I heard a few 3 C's in there. I heard get curious, collaborate and communicate was what I really heard you say, though. It's just get curious because we're often afraid of something that we don't know. And gosh, that grandma could be just the biggest blessing. I have a adopted child that we have relationship with biological family, and it's the biggest blessing that you could
Best stories I hear, honestly.
ever imagine.
Just having that grandfather call and say, but I have a ceremony coming up. I want to do this. And tell me about that. I don't know anything about that. And just gathering more family and more supports for that family. It's really a neat journey to go on.
Yeah. So, Jen, I'm curious if we have families, we have a lot of families who are raising children that are native and they're not native themselves. And so, what do you do? What do you recommend to them as far as getting connected to resources and can they help get the children connected to their culture if there isn't a kin that is readily available to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hard thing is there's so many things out there, but sometimes it's just hard to find and hard to know what's going to be fit for that kiddo. So I think the biggest thing is just being willing to have those conversations. We keep talking about conversations and communication, but um, the obviously utilizing your social worker, utilizing your licensing worker, but then also utilizing the tribal worker for that specific tribe is a huge asset. Uh, because we don't want to pretend that we know their culture either. And so using, like Jen said earlier, that kind of team approach to really give this kiddo a chance to connect to their culture that may also be new to them or maybe something that they've had in their life before our involvement and that they want to continue. Um, but for the caregivers as well, there's a lot of resources online. I think now with having more streaming options, there's, playlists on Spotify or language apps that have traditional language, cultural music that the child might be used to hearing or um, stories, books, of course. But there's some additional trainings that you guys have already done. There's some trainings through the U of M and the Court Improvement Project that are accessible to anybody. Also, the Office of American Indian Health has some online trainings that are accessible to everybody. But again, one person isn't going to know all of those things. So just really being willing to have a conversation and reach out and ask. And then when the child's old enough, also asking them, what parts of your culture are special to you? What can I do to support you participating in those things? There's kind of that common answer you hear of attending a powwow or doing, kind of those basic things that we hear a lot, but it's bigger than that. And it's going to be different for every kid. So being willing to just, again, utilize the worker or the tribe themselves, like Jen was mentioning, some of those things are naming ceremonies that a lot of tribes will do for infant children or young children that we miss when they're in foster care. So I think as a foster care placement and the social worker being willing to collaborate with the tribe to really engage in those kind of traditions is really important because then they don't lose that. But then, yeah, like when the child's older, like I said, using their own input, I think is really important because when a child even feels safe and seen because they're being asked those questions, it goes a really long way versus feeling like maybe they can't share their culture or talk about it or ask about it. So even having a caregiver who's willing to just open that door to have the conversation with the child directly.
Yeah. Stay curious, communicate, ask. And every child is so unique. One might care about the clothing, one might care about the food, and it's going to change as they age as well in different ages and stages. I just keep hearing, ask honest questions. And if we ask them with respect and we really listen, I know that I found the tribes are absolutely willing to help. Something I learned through some of the trainings that we've created is that each reservation has a college as well. And so you can connect with them and learn a lot. I did not know that, and that is a tremendous resource that's available to all of them. Um, if a child does not have a family placement, what can a foster family expect when communicating with the different entities?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that that search never ends. So as a foster parent, when a child's first placed in your home, it's there as a foster placement, not a. There's rare circumstances, of course, where that happens, but typically it's rare that it would be an immediate adoptive or guardianship placement. And so just really knowing as the caregiver that the department's going to continue those efforts. There may be a relative who was unable because of their own circumstances to care for a child, but 6 months or a year into the case, their own circumstances change. And so that's something we would continue exploring. But also remembering that even if the child isn't placed with family, the relationships with family are really, really important. Um, as a department, we do a lot of work and put a lot of effort into establishing relationships. So if a child didn't know grandparents prior to our involvement, it doesn't mean they can't, just because maybe grandma and grandpa can't be placement, even if that's a concern with their own history. If they can safely and appropriately be in the child's life, we do everything we can to facilitate that. Uh, but it's ideal when foster parents are part of that and can be supportive of it as well. I think the other thing is for the child, if that case does go to permanency where that foster parent ends up being pursued for adoption or guardianship, but they could still have grandma in their lives, that's best for kids. They like to know where they come from, and not just where they came from as far as why they were removed or what happened with mom and dad, but really knowing who grandma and grandpa were and what our family traditions were and um, what culture they came from. So having those direct family relationships to connect those dots for them is important during our case, but again, to have in place to hopefully continue after our cases are over if the child's not reunified with parents.
Yeah, because they're getting to know themselves
Yeah.
when they're asking those questions. Did you have something to add?
Just something that you said just triggered my thought process a little too, just in regards to siblings. Yeah, I think that's a piece that we continually will try to maintain those relationships, even if they're not in the same homes. So that's a challenge for foster parents. It's one more step, it's one more visit. But just if Jenn and I were siblings and we were not able to live together, the importance of that role throughout the lifetime of this child is so big that I think it's a really heavy piece for me in trying to maintain those and asking each of those foster homes, what can you do to maintain this relationship? I think those are big.
Yeah, sibling I can speak to that. I have a child who, we've got siblings that are adopted into another family, and I've just made a commitment once a year, an annual trip. We just go and we spend 3 days together, and it's chaos. It's complete and utter chaos and lovely. It's just really, really, really important for them, and so I can just speak to that and say, yes, it's true, and what I heard in what both of you were saying is reunification remains the goal until it can't. Like, up until the minute that it can, and reunification doesn't just mean with, the family that's the closest, but within the tribe itself. We're just gonna always work towards that until we can't, up until that last minute. And that brings up one of those misconceptions that I've heard more than once is people think, I could have this kid for 3 years and you could just show up tomorrow and take them and I'd have no notice about it. I'd know nothing about it. When they've heard that horror story from somebody, is that true? Is that something that can happen and does all the time?
I mean, it's so rare. There's obviously circumstances where for one reason or another, maybe that has happened or will happen, but it is rare. Usually, if a placement is going to change, everyone knows that. Or if we're moving towards placement with maybe a relative that we've identified, it'll usually start with visits and be a transition. So that's something that ideally nobody's ever surprised by. Again, that doesn't mean it's never ever possible, whether it's a safety related thing or, something that changes drastically with the circumstances of the case. But typically it would be something that's planned. That's a transition for that child. And again, the foster family would have known ideally that search had continued to find family. We try to be really transparent about that. So if we are switching gears and pursuing guardianship or adoption with that foster home, they would know that, obviously, because they'd be agreeing to that. But also being transparent throughout the case that, we are still looking at family, or I've successfully gotten some new contact information that I'm going to try. So the hope is that conversation continues, and we encourage foster families to always be asking, if it feels like you maybe don't have an update or don't know where that search is at, or are their relatives still kind of on the table as options, ask. We don't have any reason not to be transparent about where we're at in that search. Sometimes we'll do what we call a Seneca search, where we pull any possible relative for a mom or a dad and try to contact extended family that way. And sometimes there's new names on that list later in a case. And so that would be a circumstance where maybe different people are being contacted later that might not even know this child's in care. And those are always updates that the current provider has an option to be looped in on.
I want to address a rumor that, when there is ICWA in a case that the tribe can just come and take a child.
The tribe also can't just show up in the middle of the night and take a child from a home when the state has custody. And I think that is one of those misunderstandings that has gotten a lot better in our communities, but sometimes I think it's still a fear for foster parents. The department still has that authority to place. The tribe can always, that doesn't mean they always have to agree with where placement is. And that would end up in the courtroom for a placement hearing where the judge would ultimately be making a decision. So there isn't an authority for a tribal ICWA agent to just show up at a foster home in the middle of the night and say, this child's coming with me because I'm a party to this case. So I think that's an important rumor to dispel. And again, like any of the other fears that families have, we just really encourage people to be honest about what those fears are so we can either support you in what that looks like or help share some education around that misunderstanding to help alleviate that fear for foster families that are considering taking ICWA kids.
And I would say even on cases that the tribe decides to take jurisdiction, they're not showing up 10 o'clock at night. You would be, there's communication that this family knows, like this tribe is taking jurisdiction, and they may not move placement even if they take jurisdiction. So that's the legal piece of it, and then they also have the placement piece of it. So I don't know how to alleviate that fear besides that all three of us are saying it's a 1/10 of a 1% chance of whatever, right? So have we all seen it? Maybe, 1 in 100 case, 1 in 200. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'd even put a probability on it. But the reality of it is that it goes back to your 3 C's, right? Communicating, knowing who your workers are, being involved in court cases, being able to be there and be present and be educated is really the bigger piece for me.
Yeah, and when it comes to, we all wish it didn't happen, but sometimes permanency does need to happen outside of the original family. And so, Judge, oftentimes the term guardianship is used rather than adoption, and I've heard that it's preferred in an ICWA case. Can you kind of speak to that and explain why that is?
Sure, generally the tribes do prefer guardianship over adoption because it provides a basis to maintain those cultural connections for the child. But there are some other practical aspects as well. For example, for a child to possibly maintain benefits from the tribe in the future, adoption can potentially cut that off. For purposes of inheritance, especially with regard to potential land, adoption potentially can adversely impact that. And so overall, tribes generally prefer guardianship. That's not to say sometimes we don't have Indian children adopted, but even in those situations where I have these adoptions, again, I would say that it's the exception that the tribe would not be on board with that. And that's where it always comes back to that communication. Just going back to your last question, that we, at least with our ICWA court, don't seem to have as many of these issues where someone might, the tribe might get involved years down the road because the tribe has been involved from day one. And there's been a lot of communication between the state and the tribe from the inception of the case where everyone is working cooperatively to serve that child and what is best for that child. And so even in those situations where we might have an adoption, generally the tribal ICWA agent, they visited the home and they're making assessments as to whether or not adoption might be best in that particular case. Likewise, on many of the guardianships I have, if it's not a family placement, the tribe has been involved in that process. They've visited the home. They're wanting to visit the guardian. They're wanting to offer resources so that child can maintain those cultural connections down the road. That's very important. But it's about simply the tribe being part of the process.
Yeah, boy, I've been doing this a long time and I hadn't really even heard or thought about those other benefits that the child would really retain by retaining that status within the tribe itself. What are some practical considerations a family should know if a case is considered ICWA?
I think the biggest thing is just understanding that a lot of the work will be very similar. There's just another party to the case. Uh, in any case, we try to connect children and family. We try to connect them to their culture and their community, whatever that looked like. And in these cases, we just know what one of those cultural layers might be for that child, and have an obligation to support that in whatever it looks like for that child and for that tribe and that family's preferences. There aren't layers to it that are really unexpected or that are going to be hopefully a surprise or something out of left field. It really is just that added layer of connecting these children to a tradition and a culture that we can identify from the beginning. And sometimes other kids have, again, traditions, cultures, religious preferences, whatever that may be, that we find out later in a case or after parents engage. So honestly, we're kind of fortunate with ICWA cases that right from the beginning, we know what one of those pieces that might be important for that child is, and we can identify it early and just really work together to support them in connecting with it.
I love learning the different benefits of it. Anything we didn't cover that you guys want to make sure that we cover?
Another resource we have in our community is our Yellowstone County CASA office has helped us develop a packet of resources for the tribes that we work most closely with here. Some of it is general to Native American communities, but some of it's specific to tribes. But it includes recipes, it includes playlists, it includes book ideas, events, resources that can be found online, or just paper copies of kind of resources at a quick glance. And the goal is to provide that to foster families right when they get a child that is placed in their home. So there's just at least a few things that you have an immediate access to while continuing to have those discussions with your social worker, with your licensing worker, with the tribe, and ideally with families and kids directly. So that's pretty specific to our community, but I just really encourage families to reach out to their local office, because if something like that doesn't already exist, it's fairly easy to develop, and partnering in that and hearing from the foster community on what would be helpful in those packets could really go a long way.
I just want to thank you all for the work that you do and that you're changing lives of families and of children. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you.